Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to focus in on some of the important things we need to know about Reconstruction and the years following the end of Reconstruction, specifically in the South. For the purposes of this video lesson, I'm going to be utilizing this standard from the state of Ohio as part of our American history course. The standard is, following Reconstruction, old political and social structures reemerged and racial discrimination was institutionalized. So by the end of the presentation, we should be able to provide some evidence and some examples of political and social structures that are being brought back in the South following the end of Reconstruction, as well as some specific examples of racial discrimination becoming institutionalized or part of the structure of law and government in the South. Well, first, let's take a look at Reconstruction, which is the period of time following the end of the Civil War, looking at about 1865 to 1877. A very broad definition and description of Reconstruction would be that it's the federal government's Republican-led plan to readmit Southern states to the Union and, of course, to ensure the emancipation and protection of the over 4 million newly freed slaves. So it's a very challenging period in American history, and following the assassination of President Lincoln becomes even more challenging. Had Lincoln not been assassinated, Reconstruction could have possibly looked very, very different. During the period of Reconstruction, we're also going to see the addition of 3 significant amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These are going to be added to the Constitution as a means of protecting those newly emancipated slaves, especially with the 14th and 15th Amendments, and we'll get to those throughout the presentation. We're going to begin with presidential Reconstruction led by President Andrew Johnson. Johnson, as a Southerner from Tennessee, appears to be extremely lenient when it comes to the South. Now, Johnson stated that, quote, "There is no such thing as Reconstruction. These states have not gone out of the Union, therefore Reconstruction is unnecessary." So Johnson kind of adopts Lincoln's ideology that the states who did secede never had the legal power to do so. But Johnson comes off, again, as a Southerner, extremely lenient towards the South in terms of maybe perhaps holding them accountable or punishing them for the Civil War. Under Johnson's plan of Reconstruction, the following things had to be done by Southern states in order to be readmitted to the Union, and 10% of the men had to take a loyalty oath. The state must, of course, accept the 13th Amendment and abolish slavery. They needed to rewrite their state constitutions than what they were previously under the constitutions prior to the Civil War, and to pay off their war debts. Now, Johnson granted amnesty to about 13,000 former Confederate leaders, members of the Confederate government, people in positions of authority and power, which was very troubling for the Republican-led Congress to handle. So they look at Johnson as this lenient Southern sympathizer who is going to simply just allow the South to come back into the Union, not hold them accountable, and allow the same people who led their quote-unquote country during the Civil War to return to power. So this is not going to sit well with many Northern leaders. Now, what happens in the South during Johnson's Reconstruction is kind of a just return to normal. Southern states are going to pass black codes, which essentially just replace the slave codes that were legal prior to the Civil War. These black codes are going to significantly limit the rights of these newly freed slaves, these emancipated people, and try to maintain that same social order of white control and white power and black subservience. Essentially, the black codes were slavery by another name, are going to control blacks in the South, both economically as well as socially. Also in the South, we're going to see a lot of violence towards newly freed people as violence erupts throughout the South as this transitionary period is taking place between a slave society moving into a free and equal society, if you can call it that. And Republicans are going to get information from the South. They're going to have testimony and hear testimony about the conditions down there and believe that it's time for them to take more firm control of this Reconstruction period and do something about it. And we're going to begin to move into a phase called the more radical Reconstruction as we take away power from the president and put it in the hands of Congress. So this radical Reconstruction phase starts around 1866. Republicans are going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which essentially contains a lot of the things we're going to see coming up in terms of like the 14th and 15th Amendment. But the act was specifically to protect the rights of those people down south. This is going to be vetoed by President Johnson, and he's going to veto a number of these Republican-led initiatives to try to address the issues of Reconstruction in the South. Eventually, Congress is able to push forward the 14th Amendment, which is passed by Congress, providing equal citizenship, equal protection, and creating due process under the law for everybody. But it clearly defines a former slave as a citizen. That was a really big question that the 14th Amendment answered, and that these people deserve the same rights as every other citizen, and they should have equal protection under the law and guaranteed due process and all of those things. The 14th Amendment has emerged as probably one of the most important and significant amendments that we have in the Constitution. Well, we also have some midterm elections coming up. 1866 elections, midterm elections in Congress. The Republicans are going to win a 2/3 majority in Congress. So what that means, if you have studied your American government, is that Congress can now override any of Johnson's vetoes. They have the votes where essentially Johnson is no longer necessary. And this leads the Republicans in 1867 to create the Reconstruction Act, which becomes a much more aggressive and radical plan for how to handle the South. And basically what the Reconstruction Act does is divides the South into 5 military districts, which will be occupied by federal troops. It is going to increase the requirements for the South and force them to meet higher expectation of change, right? So they're going to have to rewrite their constitutions again and address and remove all of those black codes and anything else that's in there that is discriminatory or is purposely limiting the rights of individuals. They have to ratify the 14th Amendment, abolish those black codes like I mentioned, and also grant full suffrage to men so that these former slaves, these freedmen, can now exercise the right to vote. But the most important part of this is that occupation of federal troops. So as the Reconstruction Act goes into effect, it is the presence of these federal troops that is going to essentially force the South to change and to meet these new requirements. And again, those federal troops are going to play a very important part in this story. In 1868, President Johnson, again, as sort of this embattled president whose power has been greatly reduced by the Republican Party, Johnson is going to fire the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. This is going to lead to his impeachment. Not really a huge topic that I'm concerned about. We're just going to mention it here briefly. Republicans are going to charge Johnson with violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which was passed the previous year, which said that the president would need a certain approval from the Senate to fire a cabinet position like the Secretary of War. So they impeach Johnson. They find him guilty of violating the Tenure of Office Act. They put him on trial in the Senate, and Johnson is almost removed from office. They come up 1 vote shy. So Johnson remains in office and essentially with no power. So he's kind of out of our story. But down south, during this radical phase of Reconstruction, under this occupation of the federal troops and with the Freedmen's Bureau initiating and carrying out all these changes down south, actually there is quite a nice period of growth in the African American community. There are going to be some advances made during Reconstruction. Legal rights are going to be protected. African Americans are going to gain political power. There's going to be schools, businesses, churches opened, marriages taking place, access to hospitals and medical care. We're really going to see the beginnings of this, hopefully, positive transition from a slave community to a free and open community. So there are some things that are happening during Reconstruction that are meeting the goals of the Republican Party. The 15th Amendment is then ratified and passed, then ratified, guaranteeing that nobody's right to vote will be denied or abridged by the condition of their race or color or previous servitude, right? So this is to address giving black men the right to vote, not women. Women were kind of expecting also to get the right to vote at this time, but that's another video for another day. So we have, again, the right to vote protected by the Constitution. Again, a significant act that is going to, again, provide these people with political power. And with that political power, we are going to see for a few years during Reconstruction, African Americans elected to local, state, and national governments. We're going to see these guys as the first African American members of the U.S. Congress from states like Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. All elect these gentlemen to represent their states between 1870 and 1871. Guys who were former slaves are now serving in the U.S. Congress, and that's pretty awesome. But down south, of course, we do have all this animosity between white Southerners, black Southerners, and in between them stands the Freedmen's Bureau, this federal agency that at some point and at some time is going to have to leave and go back north, which would then leave the South to sort of figure it out on their own without anybody there threatening them or preventing them from doing certain things. So we have this kind of very tense relationship, and we're not sure what's going to happen when Reconstruction is over. Well, things are starting to happen in the South that are not really good. We have this mass movement of Southern Democrats to win back control of their local and state governments. These redeemers, as they're going to be known, are going to take back the South, take back their local governments, remove black representatives, stop black voters from exercising their right to vote through the use of violence and intimidation, targeting even white Southerners who are voting for Republican candidates and Republican officers. Southern Democrats are out to win back the South basically by any means necessary. And we see the formation and the organization of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League, who are going to act and organize and carry out all of these violent attacks and this intimidation against people in the South who are voting Republican. So as the period of Reconstruction continues, we begin to see slowly but surely redeemers taking control of state governments in the South and beginning to put laws into effect that are going to begin to slowly but surely eliminate freedoms and limit freedoms of blacks in the South, and moving towards a more segregated society, bringing back the South to the way that it used to be. Well, as Reconstruction continues, Republicans are going to begin to lose power, mostly because of an economic depression. In 1873, a depression begins, which, of course, you typically blame the powers who are in charge for any kind of economic success or failure. In this case, Republicans are going to start to lose seats in Congress, and the Democrats are going to campaign heavily on the economy, and because of that, they're going to begin to win more seats in Congress during the 1874 midterm elections. Also, for the Republicans, unfortunately, a whole bunch of scandals break out, and stories of corruption also give the Republican Party a bad name and begin to weaken their power base in Congress. And Reconstruction now has been going on for close to 12 years. Reconstruction has become extremely unpopular. People are kind of over it. They're kind of done with it. And the Democrats take advantage of that, right? So a lot of Republicans running for re-election are going to move away from the topic of Reconstruction and start to distance themselves from it as much as they try to distance themselves from the economy. And this gets us to the election of 1876 between the Republican candidate from the state of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrat candidate from the state of New York, Samuel Tilden. So in the election, it comes down to a very close vote. Tilden actually wins one more electoral vote than Hayes does, but he doesn't have a clear majority. There's all sorts of fraud within the South and states like Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Tilden, though, does win the popular vote by 250,000. So things are completely a mess after this election in November of 1876, so much so that Congress puts together a commission to figure out and settle this disputed election, who's going to come out and win. And it's this compromise of 1877 which will bring an end to Reconstruction. So the committee goes back and forth until they finally reach this compromise. So the Democrats will agree to support the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate for the presidency. They will not fight for Tilden anymore in exchange for the end of Reconstruction, that they will not challenge Hayes's presidency as long as he agrees to remove all federal troops from the South, essentially ending Reconstruction. So the Democrats get what they want, which is federal troops out of the South. Now, the Democrats did promise that they would protect the rights of black citizens in the South, that they would, abide by the law and all these things. We'll see if that's going to be true or not. And the Republicans get the presidency. They get to stay in power, but at the cost of Reconstruction. Because once those federal troops do leave the South, Southern Democrats at the state level are essentially just going to regain power and use that local political power to create laws limiting the rights of these freed people. So how are they going to do it? Well, they can't take away the right to vote of black voters, but they certainly can control and limit that vote. So voting laws are state laws. And within each state, they're going to begin to create things like poll taxes. So in 1877, following this end of Reconstruction, many southern states begin to pass laws requiring that you pay a tax in order to vote, a poll tax. And this tax would be paid by both black and white voters. But the objective here is to target black voters who are economically disadvantaged. They don't have very much money. They're sort of at the bottom of the pay scale in any type of job, right, because of racism and prejudice. In Mississippi, there were about 147,000 eligible black voters. By 1890, only 9,000 were registered because of these poll taxes. They just forced people to choose, between paying for maybe a house or food or whatever that you needed or paying to vote, and those other things ended up becoming a little bit more important than paying to vote. So we have about hundreds of thousands of people reduced to just a few thousand people. In Louisiana, there was a significant drop of eligible voters from 130,000 to about just 1,300 in the state of Louisiana. These poll taxes were very efficient. Now, for white voters, they also had to pay the poll tax, but the South kind of came up with a pretty ingenious way to prevent white voters from having to pay the tax. And that was known as the Grandfather Clause. So the Grandfather Clause stated that if your grandfather could vote before January the 1st, 1867, then you were exempt from paying poll taxes as well as the literacy tests, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Now, African Americans did not have grandfathers that could vote because those people would have been slaves. So therefore, due to the Grandfather Clause, white voters were able to go through without having to pay the poll taxes or take the literacy tests, and African American voters were subject to those. So the Grandfather Clause is a pretty slick way for Southern whites to avoid paying those poll taxes and taking those literacy tests. And speaking of literacy tests, those were also instituted in many states, again, to limit the vote. We can't take away your right to vote, but we can place limitations on that right to vote, and that's done through a series of literacy tests. The tests were purposefully misleading. They were difficult to read. They were challenging. The questions were designed to confuse and to create doubt in the person taking the test, and it worked quite well. Even if you did finish the test, it was graded by the poll workers who were white and were not going to pass you on that test. So poll taxes and literacy tests became a way for the 15th Amendment and its freedom and its right to vote to be limited amongst black voters in the South. This is an example of a literacy test taken from the state of Louisiana. It says if you cannot prove that you have a 5th grade education, then you would have to take this test. You have 10 minutes to complete it, and if you miss one, you fail the test. And if you want to pause and look at some of the questions, I would definitely check that out because they are very challenging initially when you read them, and it does take you a little while to think through them. And some of the questions just don't have a very clear answer, and you could kind of make up the answer or explain a different way to answer the question. So again, they're very misleading and very challenging things. And this, of course, gets us to segregation. I'll be doing a larger, more focused video coming up on segregation, but states, besides limiting voting rights and creating voting laws and poll taxes, are going to begin to segregate public facilities and public places within their states. And these will become known as the Jim Crow laws, which all ties into the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court ruled that segregation, as long as it was separate but equal, did not violate the 14th Amendment, as long as you have a white car with a black car, then you could segregate those railroad cars. As long as you have a white bathroom and a colored bathroom, you could segregate those bathrooms. So with the Supreme Court's support, in the case of Plessy, with the Supreme Court's ruling, states were basically free to segregate any type of public facility or public place within their communities. Again, limiting people's rights, people's freedoms, not taking them away, not abolishing them, but significantly limiting them. And I really like this quote from Frederick Douglass. I think this kind of summarizes very well the condition of the United States and the condition of African Americans in this Reconstruction period. Douglass said, "Though slavery was abolished, the wrongs of my people were not ended. Though they were not slave, they were not yet quite free. No man can be truly free whose liberty is dependent upon the thought, feeling, and action of others, and who has no means in his own hands for guarding, protecting, defending, and maintaining his liberty." So, to wrap things up with some key takeaways, Reconstruction was the period after the Civil War designed to rebuild the Union and support newly freed slaves. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed to help protect African Americans. African Americans did make gains during Reconstruction despite significant limitations placed on them. Southern Democrats and organizations like the KKK used violence and terror to take back state governments. The election of 1876 resulted in the removal of federal troops from the South and an end to Reconstruction. Southern Democrats used their control of state governments to create poll taxes, literacy tests in order to limit the black vote. And the Supreme Court's ruling in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson will allow for legalized segregation in many states for about 60 years or so. So, I hope this video lesson has given you a lot more insight into Reconstruction, what happened during it, and what happened in the years following it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you did learn something.